Hi, everyone. This is a research postscript on responding to gender-based violence beyond criminalization. We had this edition of reflections from our countries last November, but there were so many things happening globally, and for many of our members, it also meant a lot of draining energy and everything, and yeah. So we decided to do it afterwards, and this is the afterwards. So now almost July, but still in June, we decided to come back and reflect on what we wrote back then. Not all of the authors from the edition are here. We have fabulous Lalis, who's a feminist activist based in San Jose, Costa Rica. She's part of Asociación Ciudadana Acceder, a collective that seeks to guarantee access to the human rights of women and LGBTIQ plus communities, and also of the National Movement for Abortion. She has a background in law, so she's a lawyer, but she doesn't speak lawyer. She speaks human, I promise. And her eyes are set on community and feminist organizing. She's currently our RESURJ Finances Operation Coordinator, or our FOC, as we call her, and she likes that. Do you like that, Lalis, or not?
Yeah, I am a fan of that nickname.
I think that she was the first one advising us to use it. Uh, she wrote the Who Enforces What text on that edition. And I don't know, Lalis, if you want to start reflecting, I'm going to be presenting each one of you before your text, your reflections on your text after this. This is almost 7 months.
Yeah, I can go. So the piece I wrote was about um, police abuse of power, specifically using a recent case that we had of this young woman using her social media platforms um, to account or denounce this abuse of power, intimidation, and also sexual violence from police officers. And her case was not that different from a lot of other cases, no. So like the idea behind bringing this one forward was that, well, we had all of the facts, it had been documented, um, but my purpose with it was to bring forward this question about what happens when we as feminists have focused for so long in criminalizing policy that we sort of have given loose reins for police, at least in my country, in Costa Rica, to just roam free and abuse that power very, very frequently, no? And specifically towards women, feminized bodies, like gender non-conforming people, um, and other minorities being subject to this abuse more and more frequently, with even um, less say or less response of the system itself, but also amongst ourselves of how to respond to these abuses, and how that actively links to us being focused on a different level of work, no, on a policy work, and then not necessarily having our eyes on who's implementing said criminal policies in our countries, and who have those like first line of say, no, and how much power it has been given by people um to these groups. So that's a little bit of what I reflected on.
Thank you. And now, from this perspective, 7 months later, do you have any, like, when you read again now to prepare for this, do you have any gut reactions or any like feelings of like things that you would have adjusted, or just reflecting, "Ugh, I still have that feeling from when I wrote it."
uh i I still have the majority of these feelings. I think it's tough, no, like a lot of the times when we talk about police, there's nuances and there's very different behavior from police. Like I know for some people, police is still a body of people who somewhat are engaged with their communities. I would not say that's the case for us, and I think it does need to be like a very case by case analysis, and not just like a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to reining in that sort of abusive power or power just in general. And I think in general, whenever we talk about power, it's a whole loaded conversation, no, about like how we got to this point and what we're gonna do with it, the way it is or not. But yes, I think overall, when I reread it, there's a point that I still resonate highly with, which is the instrumentalization of female body or like female police officers by our governments. So in our case, a lot of the times when we have um, women's marches or protests or just anything related to us in streets and street action and direct action, um, the tactic has been to deploy all of the women in the police force in the front lines, no, and they're very willingly are occupying that role. And I think that to this point, like to today, I actively think it's very tough to not consider this active participation and willingness as part of this systemic oppression a problem, no, and that's a little bit of what I still have been chewing on.
Yeah, definitely. And this is something that is also happening in Mexico, at least in Mexico City. And it's quite frustrating to know how they use them, basically, and they put them against us so that it can also be like this narrative of feminists not really being for all women because they are against the women police officers, which is terrible. And I recently saw this short video from a woman in Argentina, like in a protest. I don't know if you saw it, where she's speaking to, this is a policeman, but she's speaking to him and saying like, "This is your fight too. You need to be on this side. Why are you there? I can see you crying. Why are you there? Just like remove all your things and then come on this side." And yeah, it's just, yeah, it's kind of frustrating, and we do sing and chant on our protest for them to join us on this side of the street because this is them their fight too. But yeah, it's kind of sad. Thank you, Lalis. So I'm gonna go now with Nadia. Nadia is from, well, she's based in Kuala Lumpur. She's a feminist advocate passionate about gender equality and anti-carcerality. In her work as a comms officer and countering progression team member at IWRAW at Asia Pacific, and that's why she's joining us from that account. She aims to foreground the needs of marginalized communities in demanding justice from states through the use of CEDAW. Her text is navigating feminist fault lines from accountability that punishes to accountability that transforms. And I have to say that it's really for people like us that are at the UN working on this and the frustration that we feel. I feel like your text is quite touching, Nadia. So please share with us any reflections you have. I mean, like if you want to summarize, or how would you summarize your own text as Lalis did, if you want to, but also we're we can leave it as a I don't know, like a short version or synthesis so that people can go and read it for full. But if you have any reflections from these months that have passed, please share with us.
Thanks, Ariana. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
Okay,
perfectly.
thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be in this space today. I'm really excited to be speaking with all of you. I don't think I'll do a full recap of my piece. I think it's better written. I might fudge up what I was trying to say, but I'll reflect on how I got to writing that piece and where we are, especially with IWRAW AP and our engagement with the treaty body system. I feel it's important to say upfront that I don't position myself, and IWRAW doesn't position itself as an expert on anti-carcerality. This is something that we are new to thinking about in terms of the structural issues that are in place. And I'm really happy to share my perspective as someone who works within the treaty body system, which, as you know, you acknowledge there are so many challenges, and I don't feel like they are often very well vocalized or verbalized or even acknowledged. Um, I'm happy to do that in my piece, but I'm very much here to learn from everyone as well. The piece that I wrote came out of the ongoing reflections that I was having with the Feminist Fault Lines Group, which is a loose coalition of feminist activists and women's rights advocates who are thinking about anti-carcerality in the work that we do around GBV. And that obviously is a very broad description because you can really dive deep into what anti-carceral means, what gender-based violence means, but that's probably for another space. And the piece is really me grappling with the awareness of the limitations that the treaty body system poses, specifically CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And also feeling that there is room for change within it in terms of how we as advocates and activists use it, whether it's to propose or oppose the expansion of carceral states. You know, we often, I think there's often a feeling that what we do doesn't have a significant impact because of the way that the system is structured. But there is care and thought that goes into the kind of advocacy goals and demands that we're making. And that's sort of what I'm interested in thinking about. I will say that one of the first projects that I worked on when I joined IWRAW AP was on child marriage in South Asia, which our colleague Arushi covers a little bit in her piece for this newsletter. And it was a consortium of several South Asian countries that got together to discuss the implications of their respective laws on the age of marriage and the age of consent. And the idea here wasn't necessarily to come to like a blanket understanding or application of what child marriage laws should be advocated for and how, for example, but rather to create opportunities to discuss specific contexts, what grassroots organizations were taking into consideration when they choose a particular advocacy goal or path, and how those choices might be open to critique and learning. When you work with CEDAW, treaty bodies like CEDAW, they serve the purpose of setting norms and establishing ways of approaching things like gender-based violence, and they direct their recommendations to states. And obviously, there are those who see the treaty body system as part of the mechanism that uphold carceral states, partly because of the lack of enforceable accountability, partly because of the regression that we're witnessing on the breadth of rights, anti-gender issues, partly because of its unwillingness to challenge the supremacy of borders in preventing accessibility. These are all very legitimate reasons to opt out of the system. And this very rightful skepticism has, I would say, of course, been exacerbated over the months since October 7 and the devastation that's happening in Palestine and the sort of lack of efficacy of the system responding to these tragedies. And I guess, sorry, this is kind of a roundabout way of just saying the piece was a way of trying to reflect how we try to navigate this, because I think the bottom line is that there's probably no easy answers, obviously, but a space like this, I think, is really useful for us to just start thinking about it.
Thank you, Nadia. And yeah, I now I'm reflecting on how I talk about what we saw as like the restart of the genocide in Palestine in October, and I think I sounded pretty much like a northern organization saying like, oh, the global context was yeah, but I didn't mean to skip on that and mentioning it. And yeah, and for sure it changed a lot, and it keeps changing how we see structures and institutions. And you know, like I think that it has a great impact on how we are relying on the UN in general and this kind of mechanisms, because we see when there's a big emergency, they don't have real teeth or real, I don't mean for them to bite, but you know, like how can they put brakes on things like that? They can't, basically. Where's the power? It's not there. Thank you, Nadia. We'll talk more about your piece when we have the conversation more open. I'd like to go now with Umba. Umba is a development specialist with over 10 years of program experience working with girls and women, specializing in SRH, sexual and reproductive health, violence against women, and gender-based violence, and safeguarding. She's passionate about co-creating safe spaces for girls and women in all their diversity. This text was a result of a conversation that Umba had with our comms officer, Alia, present here as RESURJ. So Umba, I don't know if you got a chance to review your conversation and how it was drafted in the end, and if you have any reflections on that that you would like to share now.
Sure. So my reflection piece was on what that alternative justice looks like on the ground. I am currently working as an independent consultant, providing technical support to women rights organizations that have gotten funding to provide support to survivors of GBV, VOG, or SIA. Um, so my piece was on looking at alternative justice from the point of the survivor themselves. What does alternative justice look like? In our project, we're using the survivor-centered approach, which simply means the survivor is at the center of the whole process. So you ask the survivor, what support do you need? Where do you want to take this? And as simple as that sounds, it's not the reality on the ground, because this survivor is meeting with the women rights organizations or people that have been trained, that have been taught that justice looks like one thing, and that is reporting to the police. So in my personal capacity, but also with the women rights organizations that I work with, there's been a lot of reflection, a lot of unlearning of the one way of looking at justice, and forcing survivors to also look at justice in just that one way. So my piece was around how that unlearning process has been like, what that looks like on the ground, but also what that might look like, I guess, in the larger scale for a lot of feminists and a lot of movements that have been pushing criminalization, thinking it's the best way to go, or it's the only way that we can eradicate or deal with GBV, even when we see that the system is not working. We have been pushing for stricter laws, for harsher punishment for perpetrators, without even giving survivors a chance to see what does that look like. And even for some cases in my project, and even outside, research has shown that there are even cases where survivors will drop off and say, oh, I don't want to continue this anymore, because there are a lot of implications, there are a lot of risks that comes with reporting. In some cases, those perpetrators are breadwinners. Those perpetrators are the same people that are supposed to support the survivor and their children. So it's very complex. So just reflecting on what that unlearning looks like, but also the role that us as feminists, as GBV practitioners, researchers, how we don't take into consideration when we're introducing new approaches, how that process is not inclusive, especially for women rights organizations that are based at community level. Because for most women in my country, and I'm sure it's the same scenario for other countries as well, the first point of contact if a woman or a girl has been abused is a community-based organization or a traditional chief, who would also refer that case to a community-based organization, and then it goes up the system. So there's rarely any involvement of those movements, of those groups at that level, of trying to see, okay, so how has this worked? How can we change things? Or if it's a matter of introducing a new approach, then how can they be part of that process as well? Because by the end of the day, it will still trickle down to them. It's still them that are going to be the first point of contact or response to a survivor of GBV.
Thank you, Umba. And I think that it is really relevant to acknowledge that. And I think that there's a very, very nice opportunity there on acknowledging who's actually responding to GBV, and who's actually being able to respond in a way that answers to the needs of the victims, no, and the survivors. So Umba, or anyone that wants to jump in also, and it can be the three of you. So what kind of alternatives do we have for justice right now? So you're saying that survivors are not looking necessarily to go to the police or to continue the legal process. But But then what are they seeking? What is your experience? What are the other things that people are actually seeking when they're looking for justice in that moment? Can you give us examples from your job? Yeah.
Sure. Sure. For so for some of the cases that we have supported, we have survivors that are looking for a space to talk through the issue that has happened or the abuse that has happened, either with the partner or family members to get involved. We have other survivors that are looking for repatriation, just to go back home, which also speaks volumes into the lack of safe homes, the lack of government funding into GBV response mechanism or structures. So a lot of the survivors want to go back home because, yes, given that's a safe space for them, they want to be with their community. They want to feel supported because that journey of reporting and following through a case can be very lonely and long. We have other survivors that are looking for support. This might be in terms of like medical support, or others are also looking for just knowing what that process or that system looks like. Because from the national referral pathways, it's very systematic. You go to this place, you do this, you go to this place, you do this. And of course, all of those services are paid for. Others don't even know where they're supposed to report a case, that there's a specific unit within the police where such a case is supposed to be reported. So it's different things for different survivors, but we've definitely seen that not everyone wants to have their case reported to the police. Some just want you to know, some just want counseling, some just want a place to stay for a few days to gather themselves, and then they'll go back. So it's different things for different survivors.
Yeah, and I can imagine, at least in my context, well, there's a lot of mistrust on the police, and I don't know if Lalis can speak a little bit more about that because her piece was specifically on remote police officers. But I think that one of the common things in Latin America is that you learn from very young that you don't trust the police officers. It doesn't matter the color of your skin or your social class or anything. You just, like, I remember one of the first things that my parents told me when I was driving on my own was like, if you get lost, like, like, keep your car running, like, keep your window really like closed, and never ask a police officer. So Lalis, what are options? What are the options? Have you thought about that? Like, what do we do with the police?
Yes, so I definitely share the sentiment that I don't think police is to be trusted. In Latin America, we have this chant, which is like "Me cuidan mis amigas, no la policía," and we sing this directly to their faces outside of the police like stations, which pretty much translates to like "My friends take care of me or look after me, not the police." Um, there's some other chants that are a little bit more intense, but also referring to the police. So it's definitely an active like area of protest or theme that is ongoing because of the power imbalance and the, I would say, aggression towards protesters, no. And in terms of what to do, like what we've also found is that a lot of survivors want it not to be repeated, so they're very interested in mechanisms that are prevention focused, be it notices in bathrooms, like women's bathrooms, and like paper, like delivery of flyers within their community to let people know that they need to be, for instance, careful with their drinks, or which is a recurring attack like mechanism here, lining drinks or with drugs and using that to abuse. So they've organized, and I think that has been one of their main focuses of action afterwards, which is very much towards prevention of others. And in terms of the police, I mean, in I can I that's why I said that it's very case by case, because for instance, in Costa Rica, we do not have an army, but that means that the police serves in some ways as a more of like a paramilitary law enforcement specialized jurisdiction as well. So there's an analysis that needs to be occurring at different levels. No, like I think the first one would be to take a really long, hard look at those specialist jurisdictions that the police has in various areas, because I think some of them might not be necessary anymore, and some of them might also be more problematic than others, and that might also shed a light as to like where we could start working with them instead of ignoring them. Because I liked something in Nadia's piece, which is and she mentioned it, like there's also like an idea of working within the system that sometimes gets very noisy, no, like there's a lot of arguments against working from within the system, and I think that happens when you work with treaty bodies, but also with the police, no, like that's an argument that we currently hear from other feminists when we bring up the problem with the police, and it's like there's nothing to be done there. But I think there's a lot to be done if we take a look also at resource allocation, because it's public resources, it's our resources that are funding and funneling into these specialized jurisdictions of police that I think need to be brought into conversation, because there might be a lot to do there. No, like one of the biggest issues is that with police here, and which also makes people not want to bring any sort of claims towards them, is one, of course, a lack of trust, but also a blatant enforcement of discrimination towards women and others, like that is very very obvious, no, like it doesn't require an actual analysis to see what's happening there. It's brushing off of violence that comes their way. It's minimizing the impact of things, and it requires not just capacity development, which is what they usually tap the shoulders of NGOs here for. It's like, oh, can you please run a workshop? I'm like, a workshop, it's not gonna even tickle the problem. It has to be a more systematic response as well, right?
Yeah, and I laugh because I can't cry, but or maybe I can, maybe I can, I should cry. But yeah, that's happening also, and I can imagine it's happening everywhere. That we just assume that it's about, um, but it's again, it's like about training, which is like individualizing the issue, right? Like if it was just because this individual in particular doesn't have the skills or the knowledge, and not talking about the structural and institutions. Nadia, you were mentioned. So, and I think that you also talk a lot about the structures that we need to tackle. And I don't know, you have, yeah, tell us a little bit more. Like, do we need to be in the structures? Do we need to be in these institutions? How do we tackle this? How do we make, I mean, this is my actual question. How do we make countries and countries' representatives to actually speak and commit to changing structural things? Because I agree with Lalis. What we want is prevention, especially on femicides. We don't want to have a response after. We want to prevent them.
Thanks, Ariana. That is the question, I think, within this space. And I'll say straight up that I won't be able to answer it because it's something that I think there's a constant push and pull within those of us who work within the treaty body system about how we navigate our context. And what you were saying, Lalis, about there's a lot of noise in this space, and you kind of have to push through it and push through your own assumptions. What I will say is that when I initially came in, I had the assumption that sex workers, for example, would never want to engage with the police, that they would refuse any sort of engagement or efforts to conscientize or sensitize the police. But as I've worked with partners in Kenya, Keswa, for example, or Aswa, there's very much a desire to use the system and to try to make it work for yourself, because as you said, it is about resource allocation, right? And the minimal resources on the ground mean that you sort of have to be as strategic as possible with the kind of activism and advocacy that you're doing. So some of our partners have actively targeted particular police precincts or areas in the districts, and tried to get them to be more sensitive to the needs of sex workers. For example, when violence is committed against them, making sure that their complaints are heard and the perpetrators are at least called up and questioned. And there's always going to be that tension, because the question that comes up is, does this change the core issue of sex work not being recognized as a labor issue? The labor rights that sex workers are denied, their right to safety, their right to healthcare, their right to education, anything like that. It doesn't necessarily, but it comes back to whether or not you're listening to your partners on the ground who are actually having these lived experiences of day-to-day interactions with the police. Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's just to say that for me, I'm still wrapping my head around these constant negotiations where I think part of the issue that comes up for us is that a lot of the conversation about anti-carcerality, at least that's happening in English in the mainstream, it's centered around prison abolition as the global north conceives it. And I know, that term is complicated, but let's just use it as a shorthand. And that's the case for many political and socio-historical reasons. And I think what I see a need for right now is for there to be a greater acknowledgement that this approach of, say, prison abolition, for example, cannot be transposed wholesale across global South contexts. What we at IWRAW are learning every day is that the context of the communities where they're located, their own historical processes, the systems in place in the countries, for example, experiences of colonization, the inheritance of specific penal codes, all these things need to be taken into consideration before we, point and say, okay, this thing needs to be dismantled. We're going to find new ways of accountability without actually taking into consideration what our partners on the ground really need. Sorry, this is kind of a ramble, but that was just what came up for me when I was listening to everyone else talk.
Oh, thanks a lot. And I yeah, I think all your tangents are really relevant. And I got stuck in the budget part, and like how are we allocating resources and how much is needed for education, for all of these systems to change, and even for democracy to work. And the little money that gets there on in health and all this idea. And I think that our idea of like defunding all military and police forces, etc. I think that it's what we tend to think, but then we have Costa Rica's example of not having an army, but still having all these other issues, and how I think that we tend to see from the Americas, we tend to see Costa Rica as an utopian system that doesn't have an army. And I think that Lalis already mentioned how that is, like problematic in itself as well. And because it's not changing the logic. And on that, I want to ask you all three, but it doesn't have to be that you all answer, but whoever wants to answer, that I think that there's this kind of logic on controlling and policing ourselves a lot, and we have learned that from the systems of oppression, either from colonization, as you shared, Nadia, and I don't know, from various ways of like being perfect and being the best feminist, etc. I think that we're doing a lot of policing in our movements, and we are also like being raised through those kind of like punishing, like the punishment logic of like, if you do something wrong, then you need to, I don't know, you stop watching TV, or you don't, whatever kind of punishment looks like in every family. But we're doing also that in our ways of working. I'm wondering if we have thoughts, or do we have any other ways of how can we negotiate, or not fix. I don't want to say fix, because we're not a machine that's broken, but how can we deal with the attitudes that we don't want in the different spaces that we are? How can we deal with that without thinking necessarily about punishment? I don't know if maybe I'm too hippie and Montessori, but yeah.
I can try. One thing I want to say, I do love that we do not have an army, and I recommend it. just as a little advertisement. It does, I think, make a really big difference, especially in countries that do not have a big budget. But in terms of our own policing, I think there's this member in RESURJ called Viva. She's from Fiji. She does great work with Diva, her organization. But she has this phrase that she constantly shares with us, which is like, instead of pushing people out, you pull them in. And I think that's a constant exercise that I have intentionally brought back to my local work as well, in terms of when somebody does something we don't necessarily like, or that has even hurt our feelings, our immediate reaction, I think, because of the way we've been socialized, is to punish, no, to prone guilt and repentment. And especially in Latin America, because we have this like super intense Catholic and Christian culture, um, built into our subconscious, even if we move away from certain religious practices. I think it's still there, and I don't think we gain anything by denying the fact that it's there. No, like, I think it's a lot more productive in terms of our movement to come to terms with the fact that we are prone to desire punishment for others sometimes, no, and what that means in terms of our movement building, and how we need to like sort of swim against that current if we want to actually, I don't know, walk the talk of what we're systemically criticizing within our organizing, no. But yeah, I like her phrase, and I think sometimes that's a little bit of her wisdom shedding into the work I do.
Thanks, Lalis. I'll just jump off what you were saying a little bit. And I think there's an interesting tension within the spaces where what you're saying is absolutely true, where um, it is productive to acknowledge the emotion that comes into these things, right? This desire for punishment, because it's so linked to our long-term and structural understandings of justice. And at the same time, I think particularly within the conversation about anti-carcerality, there's this feeling or assumption or practice that it has to be completely rational, because the first thing that comes up when you bring up anti-carcerality, it's always like, okay, but what do we do about in extreme serial killers? What do we do about violent sexual assault, things like that? And we're supposed to face this with, we have thought this out perfectly, everything has been thought through, without any emotion. But in Nana's speech, she says that these calls for death felt so wrong, and it feels almost taboo to bring that into the conversation about anti-carcerality, because it brings that emotion in, and it's kind of difficult for some people to face it directly. But it's what you're saying, Lalis, as well. Like, I think it's productive to embrace the feelings that we're having about this and say, listen, it's ugly, it's difficult, and we have to be able to allow each other to have this space. And Umba, in your piece, in your interview, I really liked how you conceptualized of unlearning as a skill or muscle. And like any skill or muscle that you're growing, it requires space and practice and grace from other people. There's a lot of pressure, I think, in feminist and nonprofit spaces to get everything correct, and it can put people off learning. And so we have to ask each other, how do we start the conversation of like, hey, this is something that I think we need to work on. It's going to be really hard. And how do we get people on board, really?
And also have to spark creativity, right? Because if we are afraid of making a mistake, then how are we gonna do things in a different way and maybe being more effective or whatever, or just like have a mistake, like like I think that it's also like hindering us from trying, from experimenting, from playing, from enjoying many things like this. I think that there's a lot of leaders that right now are feeling like seen or evaluated, or like, and that's really scary movement to be working in, where you cannot be creating and thinking out of the box. I was thinking about this part of I read this article in El País. It's a Spanish newspaper, and it was Romero is the last name, I think, from the author, and she's talking about how like the rejection harms, And she makes a link with how feminist movement can also be like harming or hurting people. And I think about Umba's piece in that sense of like how we can be very condescending to people that are facing a lot of different obstacles, and we we use this, even like the Catholic and the Christian values of the guilt, and guilt them into going to specific ways of justice, like if you do this, then you're gonna prevent this guy to do it for someone else, like this idea of like you're responsible for the rest of the people, as if you are never allowed to be selfish. But yeah, and then I also we had a discussion also about how survivors might look or seek for revenge, and then how can we think with a cold, like how can we think about alternatives, not in that moment, and not requesting alternatives from them, but giving them the alternatives. Uma, have you thought about that, like how harmful it is when the movement are, or people that are supposedly supporting survivors are actually like, I don't know, have you feel like they're condescending, or this is just something that is happening around me, that I feel like we can be sometimes very condescending?
No, definitely. I have felt that. And at different levels as well, For me, being a technical support person for these programs, I have my own um, biases, my own stereotypes that I bring into this space. So that's why then learning needs to happen at different levels, but there also needs to be space that's being provided. So there's power at each level. I have power with the organizations I'm working with. They have power over the survivors or the communities they're working with as well. So they are levels of conversation that are happening at each of those levels. And I think that also ties into the calling in that we're talking about. That there needs to be a space where space, patience, grace, kindness that's being provided for the unlearning to happen. And of course, with a lot of NGO work that we do, the condensation is mainly manifested in the ways of telling communities this is the way that things are done, this is how work is done, this is how you respond to GBV, and this is the only right way. But we know that is not true. Before all these programs, before all these policies, they had ways of working through conflict and all those things. But yeah, agreeing that it does exist, and it's all about the calling in. Because even I think with this conversation, having this conversation about thinking beyond criminalization and alternative forms of justice, it's it's not something that's going to be taken lightly by other people, because there's a lot of work, a lot of advocacy, funding, resources that went into pushing this way of working or looking at justice in this one narrowed way. So it's also seeing the best ways that we can bring people in and saying, okay, this is what we fought for the past years. We wanted stricter rules, we wanted harder punishments, but is it really working in a way that it's reflective and not pointing and saying, oh, I think you've had the, oh, sorry. And you should have thought of a better way, but yeah. Sorry
Hi,
about
if I
that.
can just thanks, Umba. Sorry, if I can just jump in before I forget my point. I think you made a really good point about kind of trying to dissect what feminists asks have been to this point. So for like working with CEDAW, for a lot of women living in especially repressive states, the CEDAW space is often one of the only avenues to, if not claim justice, then at least highlight injustice publicly. So if you're working within the system, I'm repeating myself here, but you do have the responsibility of taking care of how you use the system, right? And you have to consider how the system props up carcerality and punitiveness as the primary, if not the sole response. And one way that we're thinking about how feminist activism can contribute to carcerality is the way that we expand the kinds of harms that we ask the state to respond to. So when something is described as violence, when we decide to use violence to call something that already exists, what we're doing is we're demanding a state response, and the state response is primarily through the criminal legal system. Because I touched on it a bit in my piece, that it's a lot easier to throw someone in jail than it is to redirect the resources to the root causes of particular types of behaviors or choices within the system. So when we attach the term violence to a broad range of wrongs, if we expand the definition of violence and criminality, we risk these actions being visibilized through the action of the criminal legal system alone. So we're becoming more and more reliant on the criminal legal system. So within a process like CEDAW, when you look at the concluding observations, for example, or the kinds of questions that are raised during state reviews, the introduction of criminal laws is often taken as an indicator of implementation or of success. And national governments tend to enact criminal laws, put new laws in place or increase the severity of punishment to make a sort of public statement about how seriously something is dealt with, for example, gender-based violence, whether or not this is true. It's just a way, it's a band-aid over a bullet hole, basically. So in this context, I think this is where we have to sort of address the way that the dominant frame in addressing gender-based violence in international human rights is itself carceral.
Oof. Thank you, Nadia. It is complicated, and it's complicated to change the whole logic. I don't know if any of our audience wants to share their thoughts or ask a question, but if you want to do so, please raise your hand and we'll open the mic for you. I think it's a conversation that we keep having. We will be sorry, there's a lot of pop-ups coming my way. I have no idea what to do, so I hope that Alia can help with the technical part. But yeah, I was saying, I think these conversations is needs to keep happening, and I think that there's even though there's few places or platforms to have it, I think that it's a good opportunity to have this conversation with you three. I don't know if you have any last remarks that you would like to do on either any other text from the edition that we did last November on this topic, or from your own text, or from this conversation today. But this would be the time to do so. So please, also the speakers, if you want to speak now, you want to ask a question to any of you. Wow.
I'm good. Yeah.
You're good. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that we were able to hear your thoughts and to have many questions. And one thing that we do know in RESURJ is that this is an ongoing conversation. We're not here to share answers. We are here, I think, to reflect together, to share questions, and to be willing to open the ways that we have been working and being creative, etc. So thank you a lot. I didn't introduce RESURJ, but RESURJ is a Global South-led transnational feminist alliance. We are committed to fostering stronger communities by building trust, nurturing solidarity, and sharing power. And I think that our work on thought leadership has evolved for a lot around how to go beyond criminalization. What can we do? How can we reach justice? What does justice means? What does feminist justice means? So yeah, please also sign up to our newsletter. The name is Reflections on Our Countries. I think that is more like from our countries, but me trying to fix everything all the time and make it to be on my logic. So thanks a lot. I think that this was a great conversation. And I think it was a great edition as well. So if you can all go look
I
for
have a
it.
question.
Alia. Okay.
Hi.
I
Hi,
didn't You're part of the audience, so I did
I'm
talk
part of the
fast.
audience, exactly.
Yeah.
So I get to ask questions. No, but thank you all for a very lovely conversation, and everyone who was able to tune in. But I actually, it's just a general question, but I was thinking, because we sometimes dedicate this one edition to gender-based violence and thinking about gender-based violence and going beyond criminalization. And I was thinking if we were to also bring in a group of feminists, including the one like you all, and then maybe others, to think about this again towards the end of the year, like during the 16 days or after the 16 days, because I don't know if we if it's only necessary to talk about criminalization during that week. But anyway, what would just reflecting on what you wrote already last year, what parts would you want to get into or like think deeper about, like things that were not maybe addressed in the past edition, or even just inspired by recent events and how the world changed? Like where should we go in terms of reflection, at least, even if we don't have answers? Yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, like all of you, around this.
I'm gonna go. I cannot deal with silence, so I gave you 3 seconds. And no, I might be cheating, but I would go with self-determination and bodily autonomy. I think that it goes from the individual to the collective. This specific thing, and I think the gender-based violence goes beyond violence against women and girls, and I try to convey that on the editorial about what has been happening about the genocide and how there's a lot of news coming out and talking much more about women and children. And I think that we're leaving Muslim men and Arab men to be the characterization of the terrorists that the global north has put on a narrative. So I would like to be focused more on like what does that mean for Palestinians, for like indigenous peoples around the world, like the self-determination and the bodily autonomy of these communities, and how many rights violations they have endured in this past century. I'm not talking about like colonization or anything like that, but like this last 100 years, there's been a lot of things happening, and we keep invisibilizing that, or like pretending that it didn't happen, or like just because it makes our lives easier. And yeah, others.
Hi, I'm sorry I got cut off. Could someone repeat the question for me?
Yes, for the next edition on gender-based violence and the next November, what do you think that would be useful to be focused on? Like, what kind of a specific scope do you think this was? I mean, gender-based violence beyond criminalization, but what other? I don't know if you mean for November, or you mean in general on like thematic editions for the newsletter, Alia.
No, I think it was meant more in general about like going beyond criminalization, because we are trying to create or do this thought leadership work and bring in feminists to think and write about this more. So I'm just so my question to you was just like, what else should we be thinking about, or things that we need to dig deeper into if we were to do another edition on going beyond criminalization?
Sure. I can just say very quickly, I think it would be really interesting to push how we understand criminalization as purely within the prison system. Of course, it's people within prisons, but also those under immigration detention, forced drug rehabilitation, sex work rehabilitation. So, not just prison abolition that's focused on prisons, but other settings that behave like them as well. And thinking about how I think anti-carcerality links to border abolition as well, and for example, the extra risk that non-citizens face. That's one element of it. And another thing is, it would be a little bit meta, I suppose, because this conversation that we're having, it speaks to the nuance of language, and the challenges that comes up when you're talking about something like anti-carcerality or transformative justice. Like, do we mean the same things when we use these words? When we are speaking across languages, how helpful are exact translations? For example, when we say alternative justice in English, what are we understanding by alternative? What are we understanding by violence? People may not always want to spend that time processing and decoding how our responses to violence are not uniform. When we talk about reclaiming the narrative, for example, for a survivor or victim, reclamation isn't always desirable or possible. So how comfortable are we in leaving these gray areas across languages, across cultures, across countries, across communities? Yeah, sorry, this is a bit of a ramble, but that's just what I'm thinking of.
I really like the idea that Nadia just exposed of like having or devoting the time to also try to understand what we mean when we say some of the things that we do say, because I definitely think they mean different things, and translations are tough. No, like sometimes even within the same language, from one latitude to the next, things shift. So I think that might be a really worthwhile effort, and I think I would also enjoy to shed some light on survival strategies, what is being done and what has aided people to deal with pain or with the experiences they had. Because I think sometimes when we bring up this subject, it's very intangible, no? And some people might struggle to even imagine what that might look like. So I think bringing forward some of the experiences people have had, looking past the carceral system, might be a cool exercise.
And just to add as well, I think a lot of the work that's being done on GBV, even the laws and policies that we have pushed for, it's around response, reacting to the abuse already happening. So it'd also be good to touch on prevention. What can we do to prevent the violence from happening? And of course, this speaks into a lot of deep-rooted issues that will touch on so many other things, but it would be good that we're also shifting the focus from not only responding to GBV, but what can we do, or what do programs that are preventing GBV, what do they look like in our context?
I so agree with that, Umba, especially when we think about we were saying about resource allocation, right? How do we call attention to the fact that resources are being denied to do this prevention work because it's easier to just respond and be reactive?
Great. Ali, I hope that you were satisfied with the different answers.
Very
So,
satisfied. Thank you.
so thanks a lot again. As you can see in our Twitter profile, we are from RESURJ. Well, this is hosted by RESURJ. Umba and Lalis and myself are research members. Myself for not very long because I'm very old and I need to leave the space for someone younger, which I gladly do soon. But thank you so much. We are a Global South-led transnational feminist alliance. We are committed to fostering stronger communities by building trust, nurturing solidarity, and sharing power. Thank you so much for those who are listening in live and those who will listen recording. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Lalis, Nadia, Umba, Alia.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, everyone.
Thank you.